Welcome back to the podcast. When I last left you off, Champlain had surrendered Quebec. And the Kirk brothers, in one swoop, had taken all of New France, except for a small outpost way out on Sable Island. And I'm not even going to count that. And so, what has amounted to over 100 years of French colonial history in North America, it had all been swallowed up within the span of 18 months by the Kirk brothers. And in reference to Champlain in particular, the Kirk brothers had, him, had his wife, his 2 adopted children, and everything he had personally been working for the last 30 years. But the Kirks accepted most of the terms of Champlain's surrender. They brought food immediately to Quebec to feed everyone because they were starving. Remember, if you listened to last episode, which you should, they were down to eating 7 ounces of peas per day, and that was several months before this point in time. Furthermore, the French at Quebec were allowed to keep their farms, keep their land if they wished, and trade under English rule, or they were also allowed the option of abandoning everything and returning to France. The Kirks took Champlain and his family to Tadoussac, away from his center of power, and that's where he was held in a semi-captivity. And in this situation, Champlain actually hung out with David Kirk quite a bit. Again, the Kirks were half French, half English. They could speak both languages, and Champlain got along with them on a personal level quite well. It's reported they went hunting and fishing together. They hung out. However, Champlain was careful not to legitimize this takeover. So they were friendly, but they weren't yet friends, or they were never quite friends. In my mind, after all these years of struggle, on some level, Champlain must have had just a sense of relief that he was no longer responsible for all these moving pieces anymore. He was just a captive. He had lost, it was over, and now he can just go fishing, and that's all he has to think about. But that's how my mind works. I'm not sure Champlain was that way. Honestly, there's a lot about this guy I just don't understand. Even after reading his own writings and many biographies, what would amount to autobiographies, some of his publications, I still don't quite understand what drives the man. But at Tadoussac, Champlain realized the sheer size of the betrayal against his person by so many people around him. First of all, he realizes that some very powerful faction of the Innu had turned against him because they were working with the English. It was evident. Secondly, Champlain recognized that former Decayan employees were helping the English. This was the French company that was owned by Huguenots, Protestants, whereas now they were siding with English Protestants against their own ethnicity, who are primarily Catholic. So there's another betrayal. And then the third betrayal, where all these young men he had sent out to different tribes to be interpreters and to facilitate trade back to his trading posts, many of them had actually turned on him also and sided with the English, either because they were caught by the English and turned coat, or because they simply didn't like Champlain. There was at least 4 of them, and we have at least 3 of their names. First of all, Antony Bruel, who we've brought up several times before, who may have been in the colony from its very inception, finally betrayed Champlain and showed his true colors. Another young man by the name of Nicolas Marcellet and Jacques Michel. There's 3 of them. There's at least another one out there too. I just don't have his name recorded. And although civil and chivalrous, the Kirks were not done tearing out Champlain's heart yet. They insisted that his 2 adopted daughters, who were Innu in origin, be returned to their people. From what the Kirks understood, they were Innu women, and if they were to be deported from the colony, that would be a problem among their people. But we know from the existing records that these 2 daughters of Champlain and Helene were deeply attached to their adopted parents and to the French. And when the English tried to pull them away from their parents, they fought back physically. One of the young traitors, Nicolas Marcellet, thinking himself now in a position of power, asked Champlain if he could take the older daughter as a wife. Champlain had no love for him and even as a captive outright refused. And the native girl herself rejected him every chance that she got, calling him a traitor to Champlain and a lech. Turning to the younger sister, she replied to him,
"I would rather tear out your heart and eat it if given the chance."
In some strange way, Champlain had a wife who had a completely platonic relationship with, described as brother and sister, but he had a wife, and there was certainly some love there, and now they had 2 daughters. But the Kirks finally came to an agreement with Champlain to leave them with some French families in Quebec. Either way, the family is now being torn apart. Likewise, the Innu friendly to him at Trois-Rivières, Three Rivers, I know I'm saying that wrong, were wiped out by the Iroquois. And the Jesuits, who were probably Champlain's best friends, were deported. And so again, as much as Champlain had a quasi-friendship with David Kirk, the Kirks had completely dominated him, taken everything from him. And on the other side of the Atlantic, which we discussed the last episode, Cardinal Richelieu, in making his company of 100 associates, raised a huge amount of money and was going to revolutionize New France with a large shipment of colonists and supplies. And all of that was also taken by the Kirks. So these little upstarts, half English, half French, essentially pirates, managed to outwit Samuel de Champlain and the great Cardinal Richelieu. To further expound on this, Champlain was taken across the sea to Plymouth, England. The man in charge of the fort in Plymouth, England, was Ferdinando Gorges, who we'll learn a lot about next season. But it is from this port that New England became New England. The Plymouth settlers of 1620. Their financiers were between London and Plymouth, and then Gorges and his many different efforts managed to place settlements in Maine. There were a number of different settlements in Massachusetts Bay, including, just recently as Champlain is arriving in Plymouth, the Massachusetts Bay Company. And so, just as Champlain lost everything, there's also the reminder of what the French could have had. If you remember, several episodes ago, the French were in what we call New England way before the English were. In fact, they had a colony in the present-day state of Maine. And so even with a decade and a half of a head start, nothing. It was all for naught. And now the numbers of people living in New England of English descent would start multiplying rapidly in the next couple decades. So far, all bad news. But there was one piece of information Champlain was happy to hear of when he made it to England. And that was that a peace agreement was signed 3 months before Champlain surrendered Quebec. The taking of Quebec was an illegal seizure in a time of peace, which opened the door for France to negotiate for the return of Quebec itself and maybe all of New France. When Champlain gets to London, that's the very first thing he does. He goes to the French ambassador and he explains, "Hey, I held out. Thanks to me, we have a legal case here. We might be able to get some of this back." Then Champlain and his wife returned to France, of course, freed from their captivity. Champlain was eager to get off that boat and start working on the French end of things to rebuild everything he had lost. But Champlain was about to lose one more thing. His wife Helene, now back in France, having dealt with the conditions in Quebec for quite a while, having lost her 2 daughters, and having at least twice before asked Champlain for some sort of separation, again tells Champlain that she would rather be a nun than stay married to him. Once again, Champlain refused any sort of annulment of their marriage, any sort of divorce on Catholic terms at the time. But maybe this time her will had been emboldened by her experiences and her age and her wisdom. Or maybe Champlain's will had been diminished by just the onslaught of time and everything that had recently happened. Champlain said, "No divorce, no annulment. We're going to stay married, but I'm not going to make you go to New France with me. I'm not going to make you live in a house with me. You'll be my wife. You can manage my entire estate here in France. All of my assets." And then she finally relented and agreed to a business-like marriage where they would never see one another. But on the diplomatic end, England was willing to hand over most of what it had taken of New France. In its first offer, it neglected to include Acadia, a settlement that Champlain had not been to in a long time, but was one of the founders of, essentially, St. Croix and then Port Royal. And although having no recent connection to the colony, he fought to get that territory back as well. And he was successful. Essentially everything the Kirk brothers did was going to be undone. Realistically, on the geopolitical stage, New France was not a valuable territory. And if that could be sacrificed for England to get something greater, all the better for England. And now Champlain spent the 2.5 or so years between 1629 and parts of 1632 rebuilding New France from the French end. Again, many of the investors have been scared away by the Kirk brothers seizing basically their entire investment, their entire fleet that they had sent out to push new life into New France. All that was gone, right? And so he had almost nothing on the French end to work with. He roped in the deep pocket royalty that he knew, members of nobility. He roped in the merchants that he had long struggled with for decades now. In 1632, he published another book on New France. And although Champlain is working very hard to put New France back together, Cardinal Richelieu suggests replacing him with a man by the name of Isaac de Razilly. And Razilly, to his credit, refuses to take the job. And he suggests to Richelieu that he hires Champlain instead. Richelieu reluctantly agrees. And Champlain's new title would be Lieutenant to the Cardinal. What's interesting here is that formerly he was known as Lieutenant to the Viceroy. Now Cardinal Richelieu has stepped into the place of the Viceroy himself. The Cardinal, in this new position of power, then got rid of the Recollets. The early missionaries of New France and New France history, they're gone now. It'll only be the Jesuits from here on out. And his company of 100 associates had to sell licenses and look for new investors and new opportunities. And this opened up a number of different areas for fishing camps and fur trading posts all around what would now be called Canada, and even some places further flung off. Champlain, being a company man, invested in every single new opportunity the company licensed out. Champlain has a hand in appointing leaders for these new operations, and this is where Champlain's vision for New France really shines through. It wasn't just about trading posts in Quebec. This would be the beginning of a larger New France that would be decentralized. It wouldn't all be centered around Quebec or Port Royal, Acadia. The long-term legacy of New France, and where the story will take us for the next 130 or so years, is that it became so large, so vast, so sparsely populated by actual French people, and relations with the natives were so kind in comparison to that of other Europeans. And this story of a vast inland empire begins right now. Not that any of them would have known it. But during this time in France, what's going on in New France? Well, at a certain point, the English are forced to hand over, very amicably, to the French, Quebec. And it won't be to Champlain at first. It'll be to Emery de Caen, who owned the monopoly before the Company of 100 Associates, and was still entitled to recoup some costs from losing that monopoly. And so the French court gave him a 1-year period to collect whatever he could from the colony in terms of pelts to pay off his debts. And the English did a number on all of our settlements so far. So they sold guns to the Innu. They attacked other Innu just to get their food stores. And as soon as they realized that everything would be reversed and the French were to receive Quebec back, they trashed everything. They spent no amount of time or money upkeeping any of the structures, and they generally treated everything as you would something you rented fully insured. Luckily for de Caen, there were some allies of Champlain still out there. Again, he had sent people to live among the natives deep into the interior of North America. At least one of them, Jean Nicolet, was one of these coureurs de bois, these young men sent out to be translators. And he came out of the woods to greet Emery de Caen. Those loyal to Champlain were starting to creep back into the trade. All was not lost after all. Champlain had some friends. They were just flung to the far corners of the known world. The Kirk brothers, for their part, having taken everything from the French very quickly, now had to hand it all back. And they did so quite peaceably. They were very loyal to the English king, and they did as he said. And as far as official compensation, they received nothing. A few of them were knighted. They would receive grants of land and titles to various parts of the New World that were controlled by the English indisputably. But as fast as they came, they're out of our story. Officially, it'll be the year 1632 that all this occurs. The Iroquois visit Quebec, looking to open up trade relations, once again with the French. On paper, New France was returned to France in payment for a dowry that Louis XIII was owed from the King of England for his sister. And in this very same year, we see the first publication of the Jesuit Relations. Now, all you history nerds at home are freaking out right now. The Jesuit Relations, really? This was it right here? Yes. Father Paul Lejeune publishes the very first edition of this, which, if you do not know, is a massive volume of the observations of the Jesuits among the Native Americans and the First Nations people of the eastern portion of North America. it would be published for years and decades, and I think there's probably 120, 130 years of this stuff. And in some cases, it's the only source we have for some of these small tribes that disappeared in the interior of North America. A lot of the Iroquoian people west of the Iroquois Confederacy. Sometimes the only source we have existing to this day, primary source, is the Jesuit relations. It is inseparable from the history of early colonial North America. It is the source to go to. And just one more aside about it, just think about it. You're taking a French Catholic priest and placing them in the middle of a different continent among an animist tribe. Just imagine what they would write about. Just imagine it. We've quoted it several times on this show, but they're wild. They're just insane. Because from the Jesuits' point of view, what they're seeing is just otherworldly. And in many cases, they don't even understand what's going on. And so it's taken several hundred years of scholars studying native cultures and French culture at the time to really understand what these Jesuits are seeing, because they themselves don't know. All right, I'm done with that. Jump ahead to May 22nd, 1633. Champlain arrives in Quebec, and Emery de Caen hands over control to him. This moment is significant not just because it's the end of the de Caen family having any control over New France, but it's the end of Protestantism at all having a prominent role in New France. The Huguenots, of course, French Protestants, or any of them for that matter. Now, we've seen the Huguenots attempt colonies in Florida, which they considered part of New France. We've seen Huguenots in and out of the dealings with Champlain, often his boss. Go back to Jacques Cartier way in the beginning. On his third voyage, his boss was Roberval, a Huguenot. So Protestantism has been fairly prominent in the history of New France, but no more. From here on out, New France would be exclusively Catholic. Of course, there will be exceptions. But now we're entering a period of time where the Catholic Church in New France will be as powerful as the Catholic Church in France, and at certain times more powerful. When Champlain arrives again, he finds everything in ruins, including his own house. He no longer has his daughters. He no longer has his wife with him. Personally, he's at a low point. But career-wise, he's about to hit probably the highest point he'll ever get to. Quebec only had a couple dozen colonists, but he brought 150 with him upon his arrival, essentially restarting all of New France with this 150 people. These would include families, whereas most of the population of Quebec had been single men. Now we have the very beginning of the natural increase that will often happen in colonies when you bring families along. And so there's going to be a lot of babies. And boy, does France have a lot of catching up to do compared to the other imperial powers. New Netherland is taking off quite nicely. New England is beginning to boom. And so I suspect if Champlain and Richelieu had not arranged for 150 new colonists at this point in time, wouldn't be very long before all of New France would have been taken again and for a final time. The clergy at Quebec are very happy to see Champlain again. De Caen again had been a Protestant, and the English, of course, were Protestants. Now suddenly the Catholic order was back. They were relieved. There were some families in Quebec, one or two extended ones, and most of them wanted to go home at this point in time. But I imagine even with these troubles and these concerns, Champlain was full of optimism. He went about fortifying everything he could, rebuilding everything up and down the St. Lawrence. And of course, the most important thing to rebuild were the French relations with the Native Americans. It's reported that when Champlain assumed power of Quebec, much of the native trade was ruined. The furs weren't coming in. Many of the groups were not getting along with many of the other groups. The English had been selling them alcohol for years now. The finely quilted network that the Innu and the Huron and the French had worked together to create had fallen into shambles. Champlain's oldest allies, of course, were the Innu, and they came to him before any other group. Now, there was some faction of Innu that conspired with the English during the takeover, but they obviously were suddenly very silent in May of 1633. And this is when Champlain learns about a lot of the problems involved in the trade and a lot of what went down under the English. Now, at this point in history, the Innu had become dependent on European goods coming from the French. It had been at least 30 years of solid trade under Champlain. And so, things like metal arrowheads they came to depend on, whereas before they knew the fine skill of knapping flint into a small arrowhead, those skills were now only known by people who would have been in their adolescence 30 years ago. And so the old skills were dying off quickly by this point. And then, of course, being in such close proximity to the French, there had been a number of old world diseases which had ravaged the Innu. And being the source of the trading posts for the French, the Innu territories had been violated over and over again by their supposed allies, other tribes that wanted to trade with the French. They used to have to go through the Innu, and now they could simply plow right past them. The Innu would cite the Huron and the Abenaki in particular. Overall, the fur trade was simply moving beyond the Innu. Beaver don't procreate quite as fast as other rodents we might know of. And so if you're actively hunting beaver, it wouldn't take very long to hunt them completely out of your territory. And so furs had to be found further inland, the Innu always having a diminished amount of them. Meanwhile, they became dependent on the French for their furs and for their boats, for pots and pans and baskets. All the native skills were going away. Not that they were able to express all of this to Champlain or even be quite aware of it in its totality. But Champlain, he normalized relations. He promised the Innu he'd fix everything up. And he even said to the Innu, "Our young men will marry your daughters, and henceforth we shall be one people." This is a curious thing. Of course, the natives would have understood this. Intermarrying members of different tribes was an important way of keeping those tribes allied with one another and potentially united over time. And this is one example of several where Champlain is actively advocating for what you would call today an interracial marriage of two people. Whereas other colonizers were looking to just wipe out Native Americans and then replace it with a European population, Champlain several times mentioned, well, we're going to, a lot of men are going to come over here and they're going to marry Native women, and then we'll have this new ethnicity altogether. By the way, that's exactly what happened. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. In June of 1633, the Mohawk make an appearance on the St. Lawrence, and they attacked a shallop. They killed 2 or 3 men, and perhaps this was their way of saying, hey, I know we came and met with Duquesne the year before, but there's going to be no peace between our two groups. So the Iroquois, they stopped by, said hello, killed a couple people, but at least Champlain knew where they stood. And then in July, the Huron came by, hundreds of them in a war party, looking to recruit Champlain and the French once more to attack the Iroquois, which Champlain has avoided doing for many years. But as a renewal of an alliance, a military component was often required. Champlain, showing them the rubble that was all around him and all the work that needed to be done, managed to put off the issue of warring with the Iroquois, at least for now. Another issue was what to do with the traders. Now remember those young men who had worked with the English and managed to collapse everything Champlain had built up? One of them was still hanging around, Antony Bruel, who we've talked about the most. Now at this point in time, he has very good relations with several native groups. Several other native groups don't care for him at all because of his liking of women. But in front of the Huron, he labels Antony Bruel a traitor. He says he wants nothing to do with him. He essentially disowns Antony on behalf of the entire French people. Bruel will have to live with the Huron, who at first take him in. Now this is where the record gets sketchy. So at one point or another, already being branded a traitor, he was suspected of planning to set up a trading relationship between the Seneca and the French. At least one version of this story goes. The Huron, of course, not liking this. And inevitably, Bruel was killed. Now the details get sketchy again. Some say he was killed. And for the reason I stated, some say for slightly different reasons. And then some sources say they ate him. And so although he had been with Champlain possibly since 1608, the very beginning of Quebec, his story had ended in somebody's pot, perhaps. But the story of New France did not end, and Champlain was rolling out institutions that'll be around for another 130 or so years. He immediately increased the number of seigneurial estates. That'd be allotments of land where essentially the owner of it would be like a feudal lord. At this early date, many of them working their own land, but later on having people work for them on allotments. Champlain orders Jean Nicolet, one of those coureurs de bois that remained loyal to the French, to go off and explore to the far west. He'll be the earliest European to record of these experiences in parts of what will now be the Midwest United States and parts of Canada, and where New France was destined to expand outward into. Furthermore, in this very same year, he fires off a letter to Richelieu suggesting that New France develop a small unit of French guerrilla fighters who can work with a larger native coalition in order to attack and possibly take the English right off the map as far as North America is concerned. This would be the model of successful New France operations for, again, 130 years to come. Champlain had that in his head already. Whenever the French did well in these colonial wars, they followed the model Champlain just laid out. A very prophetic man. He seemed to know exactly what was going to work for New France in the future, for many years to come. David Hackett Fisher says of the magical year 1633, Champlain was the absolute ruler of his domain, subject only to the will of Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu. Moving into the year 1634, Champlain builds up Trois-Rivières, 3 rivers, from just a mere trading post to a formal settlement. One man who was granted land there, Jacques Hertel, would have relations with a Mohawk woman at some point, and their offspring would be an ancestor of mine. So this is important to my life, as I wouldn't exist without this seemingly unimportant detail. And in fact, in this very same year, the French start opening up relations with the Oneida on the other side of the Iroquois Confederacy. And now furs aren't going to flow quite as easily to Fort Orange, controlled by the Dutch on the Hudson River and the present site of Albany County, New York, but rather up to the French. This loss of trade harmed the New Netherland colony greatly. And in December of 1634, a young man named Harmon Vander Bogart, a barber surgeon from Fort Orange, was tasked with going into Iroquois country and finding out what happened to the trade. And now this record that he created is the first primary source we have of a first-hand account of what these Iroquois villages looked like in the 1630s. It's the earliest source we have. And it only exists because this poor young man was forced to go out into the wilderness in wintertime because the French had spoiled the trade. And I'm also related to this guy, so that's why I find it important. On the other end of native relations, the Huron deepen their alliance with the French, and they agree to take on Jesuit missionaries. The ramifications for this I don't even have time to go over, but there will be future episodes on the Jesuits in Huronia. Moving into the winter of 1634, right into 1635, there's a mass starvation among the Innu population that led to widespread cannibalism, which, as you can imagine, disrupted the entire Innu political, social landscape because people went out into the woods as far away from one another as they possibly could. It's recorded that the Innu were hiding from each other, both from fear of being eaten or as a reprisal for eating someone else. The spring of 1635 would be no better for them, because then a plague broke out among the Innu, which was probably smallpox. The entire population weakened from malnutrition and starvation. It ravaged a people that had already been dealing with so many things, like we talked about: starvation, fear of cannibalism, the Abenaki and the Huron going right through their territories, the English introducing mass amounts of alcohol. The list just keeps going on. And in their weakness, private traders bend the ear of a few Innu chiefs and suggest that they, even in their weakened state, attack the Huron. Because if you attack the Huron, you'll regain the fur trade, and instead of directing it to Champlain, who isn't helping you, you can direct it towards us. So all that stewing, and then in all the fracturing and disorder, Champlain comes in, and it's recorded that he insists that he should be able to appoint Innu chiefs. Now, this is the one point where Champlain just is clearly out of bounds with his relations with Native Americans, and one wonders what was going through his head, or what was going through the Innu homeland that he felt he could step in and demand such a thing. Of course, he was rejected. Or maybe at this moment he felt himself the most powerful. Either way, October 1635, Samuel D. Champlain suffers a stroke. The symptoms began at his lower extremities and slowly moved up his body, seizing him, until it made him essentially paralyzed, although his mind still active and awake. Perhaps able to mumble a few words, he became a prisoner in his own body. Now suddenly he was quite powerless. Having no family, the only person who looked after him was Father Charles Lemont, who had become quite good friends with Champlain. And at this time, obviously, the state of medicine wasn't anywhere near what it is today. But generally, people knew that this was the end. This is when one was circling the abyss. Le Mans would read to him, talk to him, comfort him, take care of him physically, and made sure he took confession, doing this while also founding Quebec's first school. In October turned into November, and at this point he makes his will, and he's visited by all the important people of Quebec and of the larger New France. Perhaps these people were a comfort to him. Maybe they thanked him for everything he had done for their life, essentially. Or maybe it was just one miserable time. This is a weird thing. Authors like David Hackett Fisher will note that as Champlain lay dying, he was essentially victorious in that he had built the foundation of what will one day be a great colonial empire. But how would he have known that at the time? Other authors describe this time in different terms, where David Hackett Fisher will say, well, geez, by the 1630s, once Champlain had taken back Quebec, he was surrounded by subordinates and essentially had more control over affairs in the St. Lawrence than he ever had before. He was at the top of his power. He was supreme. But there's the flip side of everything, where you could look at Champlain at this point on his deathbed, no wife, no kids. His only friend, a Jesuit he met several years before. The old-timers in Quebec, many of them desperately wanting to go back to France. The supposed colonial empire he had built thus far for the French being smaller in size than what the English had, what the Dutch had on the very same part of the continent. His oldest native allies, the Innu, had just spent the winter eating each other and were being influenced by foreign traders to go to war with another one of his allies, the Huron, and so problems were abounding. And then in the one view again, where Champlain is suddenly at the center of all of New France and everyone's looking up to him, is it that he's somehow made himself the patron of all the French people in the New World? Or did he simply outlive everybody else and all his friends are dead? His old buddy Pontgrave, all mentions of him disappear right around the time Quebec is taken. So he's dead, apparently, or not part of Champlain's life at all anymore. Everyone he knew in Acadia, not part of his story right now. A lot of the young men that he would have brought over with him, like Antony Bruel, are dead. Or the other traders, God knows where they are, but they aren't in the St. Lawrence anymore. So I wonder if he was really surrounded by admirers, or if he was just in a vacuum of peers. Anyway, Christmas Day, 1635, Champlain dies. A while later, his replacement shows up, a man by the name of Montmagny. As it turns out, Richelieu had sent him out in 1635 without even knowing Champlain's condition. Montmagny was ordered to fire Champlain and replace him, and to assume a title that Champlain never received, of governor. And so Champlain died just in time to avoid the final insult of being fired from everything he had built up. Father Le Mans, back in France, personally told Helene of Champlain's death. We don't really know the feeling she had, being Champlain's estranged wife, but she finally became a nun. She joined a convent and sold off Champlain's massive estate, giving a huge chunk of that, of course, to the Catholic Church. At this point, I would move into the legacy portion on Champlain, which I'll talk about a little bit, but I've peppered this episode with legacies, if you haven't noticed already. It's important to see how Champlain making one or two little decisions creates a butterfly effect that creates the world we know today. So let's check out some short-term legacies of Samuel de Champlain. First of all, despite being fired on his deathbed, the man actually turned a profit for the company. It's noted in the ledger books that between the years 1632 and 1637, it was a profitable time. Champlain not only made the company money while he was alive, but set up the next two trading seasons with stable enough relationships with the natives. And Champlain's assets in Quebec were given out to the people that he had known throughout the many decades in the colony. But scholars call him the true founder of New France. Not all these people we heard about for hours and hours beforehand in this podcast. Champlain is the founder. and I would agree with that assessment. Let's hit some of the high points, shall we? In terms of how to interact with the natives, Champlain wrote the playbook for the people and the government and the military of what will be New France, to the benefit of the natives and the people of New France, and their ensuing and long struggle against the English, who had a less favorable outcome for the natives in mind. David Hackett Fisher writes, "In the best spirit of the Universal Catholic Church, Champlain's piety reached out to embrace all humanity, an attitude very different from that of the Calvinists who founded New England and New Netherland." Champlain's New France would be far more accepting of native cultures, let's not talk about Protestants, but native cultures, than New Englanders will be. The Dutch at best were disinterested. The English will become interested in all the wrong ways, as we'll find out next season. These attitudes would create a powerful New France that stretched throughout the middle of the continent and worked as a shield against many of the English incursions. It was this weird, almost indefinable political structure of combining French rule with native alliances that Champlain first innovated by occupying the St. Lawrence while simultaneously being occupied by the Innu and other groups. Many modern critics will criticize him for occupying native land without native permission. But as we've talked about before, the St. Lawrence was emptied some decades before and never replenished, as birth rates weren't terribly high in the era of plagues. It's clear that the Innu welcomed the French. Now, other people point out that the St. Lawrence Iroquois who disappeared in this area, many of them sought refuge among the Mohawk, or some people even claim the Mohawk were the St. Lawrence Iroquois. One scholar who runs the website Wampum Chronicles, which I've thoroughly devoured, I love that website, his name is Darren Bonaparte, and he is one of the few who argue that because the St. Lawrence Iroquois sought refuge among the Mohawk then had the territory that used to belong to the St. Lawrence Iroquois. Thus, Champlain had interloped. This is probably the one point where I actually disagree with Darren Bonaparte, because I respect him very much, because based on all the existing records, it appears that the portion of the St. Lawrence that Champlain settled in was clearly, at least in the beginning, controlled by the Innu. But anyway, let's rattle off some legacies real quick. Right in the beginning, Champlain envisions a Panama Canal, back when he was a spy in New Spain. He might have been the first man to do it. It's the earliest record I can find anyway. He participates in the first settlements of De Monts, which actually St. Croix ends up being in modern-day New England. Champlain also maps the coastline of what will be New England. Of course, he calls it Acadia as part of New France. Champlain visits the future site of Plymouth before the Pilgrims ever thought to set foot there. The historian Bruce Trigger points out that Champlain, square into the 1630s, was often the only real French official in New France. And so for several decades, all the successes and failures of New France could pretty much be put on his shoulders, which is quite a burden to carry and quite a legacy. And as I'll point out once again, his interactions with the Native Americans were unparalleled, at least at this time. And he set the tone for a far more integrated culture than what we would see, especially in New England, and then down in the southern colonies with their natives. And this would color the French plan for the New World all the way up till its demise. Francis Parkman says, "The scheme of English colonization made no account of Indian tribes. In the scheme of French colonization, they were all in all." And at the root of that scheme is Champlain. And then lastly, by the very end of his life, he had worked towards or invested in every single French venture in what will be North America. Now follow me on this. Most Americans who are French are actually French-Canadian, or their ancestry comes by way of New France one way or the other. It wasn't straight from France to the United States. Of course, there are some, but most of them would actually find their roots back in French colonial history, which today would be millions of Americans, and then millions more who have French ancestors who don't identify as French at all at this point, such as myself. David Hackett Fisher, in his very famous biography on Champlain, hammers this point home. Champlain played his part in the Acadian community, both as a settler early on, builder, designer, explorer, and then later as an investor and promoter. And that Acadian community, of course, would remain in modern-day Nova Scotia. And then many Acadians would be deported to different parts of what is now the United States. Of course, the most famous group of them would become known as the Cajuns, who are also a mixture of other French people who existed in French Louisiana, which of course covered a huge chunk of the modern-day United States. Well, it was Champlain who started that westward movement, the westward expansion of the French, we mentioned several episodes ago. And right towards the end of his life, he was sending out explorers like Jean Nicolet to the west. He began what would be the first hints of the French Louisiana territory. And he certainly established the fur trade that would link all of this together and necessitate that the French expand to the middle of the continent. He invested in the far-flung fishing outfits, seeding the Maritimes and other places with various French ancestors today. He was also a big promoter of the Métis population, the Métis population, as the Anglophones would say, the Métis, the group of people who exist culturally, linguistically, somewhere between French and Native American. And then it goes without saying, of course, the modern-day Canadian province of Quebec owes quite a bit to Champlain, right? Because he is the founder of Quebec. And then for us Americans, especially up here in the Northeast, there was a lot of immigration south across the border from Quebec into New England and parts of New York. Champlain is 3 or 4 dominoes, and a long line of hundreds of dominoes that lead to the modern-day world. Who's in it? Who's not in it? And if we were to take him out, the butterfly effect would be drastic. People like myself, who seemingly have no connection to New France or Champlain whatsoever, would suddenly not exist. And this podcast itself would just